All right. Hey, good morning. It's man, it's a short week for all us working stiffs. We're already midweek, right? It's Wednesday. It ought to be Tuesday. So, good. Appreciate those long weekends and short work weeks. So for me, I mean, I have like just a day and tomorrow, and I'm done again. So I've got the weekend to play. I'm looking forward to that. Man, yesterday was hot here. 110 degree, I think, heat index. And for whatever reason, I chose that part of the day to dig 4 holes to put some blueberry bushes in. But we're moving forward. So, man, I hope everything's good in your world. And we're looking forward to just jumping into looking and seeing what we can discover in the book of Romans. And so that's where we are. We are making our way through. We're going to finish up chapter 1 today, and we're going to jump right in it. So I called this Satan's Old Boy Club. I don't know if anybody knows what an old boy club is, but it's kind of like just a little fraternity kind of thing. But it's what it feels like when I read through this book of Romans, this section. It's like Satan loves to get a group of people to disobey God, and then to encourage each other, which is a phrase in the scripture that's kind of strange, to do the same thing. And so you see that Satan is alive and well. So we've been watching this, reading this rather, to understand how we find ourselves in the mess that the world is in. And it's so because when you reject the revelation of God, listen, there really is no debate. There is a God. Now, whether or not it is the God that we worship or someone else, that potentially is up for debate. But the fact that there is a God is not up for debate. Design demands a designer. You have to move into the absurd to believe that this just kind of happened by some sort of bang, some sort of matter, which where would that have come from to collect together? To believe that that just happened is idiocy. To believe that matter and these things were here before the world was formed necessitates that someone put that there. So no matter what you look at, you have to go beyond that. There was a power, a higher power. We call that God. But when you reject that, when you look at creation and go, nah, nobody made this, it just happened. And then you begin to say, if there's no God, I'm going to worship me, or I'm going to worship creatures, or I'm going to make up a religion. So that's what's happened. So there was a revelation. God revealed himself, Romans says, through creation and conscience. Yet then man rejected that, right? That's what we see. We didn't want God, so we reject that God. And then God turns us over. 3 times it says that God gave them over. And so God turns us over to our own foolishness. And so we begin to think irrationally because our minds are darkened. Then foolishness enters in. When you remove the Spirit of God, who leads and guides people into all truth, when you do that, and the Spirit of God is gone, there's a void there. And so it's a filtration system. You're now living an unfiltered life. You may be slightly more moral than someone else as we would scale morality, but you're still what we call a dirty, rotten, stinking little sinner. And so this is what happens. And then you begin to, because you're irrational now and you think, God, maybe there is a God, then you start replacing the God Most High with things formed by men. So we worship sex, or we worship Buddha, or we worship a cow, or we worship whatever those things are. And that's where we've fallen into. When you ignore or reduce God to a docile little sidebar, some grandfather, a doting little grandfather, then you're beginning to mess up the world. When you make Jesus kind of a free love hippie kind of a God, then this is what's happened. And that's what we've done. We've made God, if we believe in one, to be some sort of grandfather that has got good wishes for us, and we can call on him, and maybe he'll make us feel good, but he really lacks the power to make things happen. And as far as Jesus is concerned, he was a good man. He was a wise man. He was all about love, and so that just makes us feel warm and fuzzy. But to think of him as as the wrath of the Lamb, a lamb that has wrath, to think of him as God, very few people do that. And so this is what happens. So when you do that, you've begun to move into the realm of idiocy, and that's where we are. So this is what he says in verse 28. Furthermore, I've kind of brought you to that. He talked about the one sin that we looked at yesterday, which is unnatural relations, because that's where Satan wants to attack. He wants to attack the institution that God established. God established first the institution of one man, one woman in matrimony together till death. That's his way. And there was a specific purpose for that. There was companionship that was going to take place. There was a complementarianism so that we would realize from the get-go that we need each other, right? And so she is his helpmeet. That's not that she is his servant. That's why when Paul gets along, he says that women submit to their husbands, but husbands submit to their wives also, Ephesians 5:21. Submit yourselves one to another. Why? Because we recognize that we need each other. And so God establishes a man and a woman, and what is their job? To propagate, to multiply, to bear children, to procreate, right? And so this is the deal. So Satan wants to destroy that movement. He did from the beginning because he knew that when God said from her seed the serpent would be crushed, that he had to stop that. And so he tried to pervert it every way he could. He is still seeking to do that. So he has destroyed that. And the best way to do that is to turn men and women away from each other toward themselves, because two women can't propagate the earth. Two men can't propagate the earth. There's no procreation that's going to happen in that realm. And so as he turns him over, Satan goes, great, come with me. And he turns into this sexual immorality and this disgusting thing that is not even natural, and that's what happens. Now, I realize that's an affront, not politically correct these days to talk about homosexuality that way, but it is what it is. And that's what the scripture says, and I'm unmoved in that. I know what it says. And so this is where we find ourselves. And so then he says in verse 28, now, as gross as those sins may be, it's not the end-all, be-all sin. Now we get a grocery list of which you and me may feel a little uncomfortable as we read through it, because we can identify with these. He says, verse 28, furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, though they didn't want to hold on to the fact that God is evident in creation and in our conscience, and that there is a God and we should worship Him, and we don't want to hold on to that. We want to pretend there's not. We just want to put blinders on and go, no, there's no God, there's no God, there's no God. Right? Kind of like what happens when you're a kid and you're in the bed and you feel like there's monsters under the bed and you just start mumbling to yourself, That's what's going on. So God gave them over to a depraved mind. That is a reprobate mind. That means it's a foolish mind. It's an empty-headed mind. So the mind has been darkened. This is all mankind. Such were some of us. Now, all of us. So God gave them over to a depraved mind so that they do what ought not be done. Right? This is what's going on. This is what happens. When God gives you over to a depraved mind, you begin to act foolishly, right? They have become filled with every kind of wickedness. Now, before we get there, I just want to kind of remind us, I want to go to a couple of passages of scriptures to kind of give some perspective of this, to see what it looks like. If we go to Genesis 6, we've spent a few thousand years on this planet, and mankind has gone to the extent that God says will happen if you ignore Him. And it is in the days of Noah. But listen to what he says. The Lord saw, Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Their heart was always just leaning toward evil all the time. The Lord regretted that He had made human beings on the earth, and His heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race that I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along on the ground, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Now, if we get to, so that's what happened, right? And so wickedness just reigned. And that's what happens when you choose to ignore God and pretend there is not a God. Now, so the earth is multiplied, and procreation has taken place after Noah. God told His sons to be fruitful and multiply. They did so. The nation of Israel is formed as we go through this. Moses has delivered the nation of Israel from Egypt by God's hand. Moses has perished. Joshua has taken over. Now Joshua is going to die. They have spent 40 years in the wilderness. They wandered around with Moses. Then they began to conquer the land of Canaan. But they, instead of being holy and righteous, they allowed some of that into their world. And so then they became perverted. And here's what happens in Joshua chapter 2, verse 6. And Joshua had dismissed the Israelites that went to take possession of land, each to their own inheritance. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel, right? So they'd seen these things, and so they're still serving him, but there's a measure that isn't. Then it says this, verse 10, after that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshiped various gods of the peoples around them that aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashereths. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of the raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of the enemies all around whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them. What we're seeing there is this played out, right? That's what we're seeing. You ignore God. You pretend there is no God. That's what happens. They began to do evil. God turns them over to it, and they saw havoc all their days. So it's important that you and me just see this. So how did that happen? Because they knew God. Apparently, one generation forgot to continually remind the other generation of the works of the Lord. And so we can talk today about what's wrong with Americans because we took God out of schools. I would beg to differ with that. I don't think that's the place where we're going to find God, nor should we expect to find God in a schoolhouse. The reason why America and the rest of the world has gotten to where it is because the family has forgot to talk about God. That's the issue, right? This is Ephesians chapter 6. This is what Paul is telling the fathers, and listen to what he says. Children, obey your parents, and fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the fear and admonition of the Lord. Right? There is this training that should be taking place. It is the great Shema. It is what Israel was known for. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. And these commandments, these moral truths that I have given you today, they are be on your hearts, and you have to impress them on your children. You have to talk about them when you sit at home. You have to talk about them when you're riding down the road. You have to talk about them when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. What's Moses trying to do? Don't forget the Lord your God. When you do that, depravity is always the result. And so this is where we are. That's kind of a little sidebar to get us to where we're going to look at these scriptures in Romans. But that's what's going on. Listen, so that's why our country is in trouble. This is why the world is in trouble. Look around. What I'm getting ready to read to you, you are going to see in America at least. Man, I think sometimes Europe has seemed to have more moral bearing than we do. But you can't help but see, and I don't mean to nationalize this. This is a personal thing. We can see some of these even in ourselves because it's the residual of that old man. That's why we're told to put off the old man. It's a dog fight, right? Reckon the old man dead to sin, but alive to God in Christ. I can't tolerate sin. I can't let the world squeeze me into its mold, right? I'm to present my body a living sacrifice daily. It's a present tense in Romans. Daily I present my body as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to him. And so we put off the old man and we put on the new man through the Spirit of Christ. This is what we should be doing, but this is the result before we even get to Christ. This is the result of what happens when men no longer acknowledge God. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, right? That's just unrighteousness. There's no righteousness. There's no doing holy. There's no keeping commandments as a whole in this depraved society. They're evil. That's just they're wicked. They're just evil. They're full of greed, and that's what happens. Listen, they were in the garden, it says, and they were naked and not ashamed. That's because their eyes weren't on themselves. Their eyes were on loving their neighbor as themselves. Inherently, that's in us to do that. But then when sin came, it says they were naked and were ashamed. What happened? Their eyes moved down. They began to look at themselves. When you begin to focus on you and not others, greed is always the result. And this is what's taking place. They're greedy, and they're full of depravity. That is empty-headedness. They're gathering all these toys, not knowing that when you die, it all goes back in the box. Right? That's what happens. But yet we're depraved. We're foolish in our thinking. So we're like, let me just amass stuff, not even understanding the principle of generosity, not understanding that he who refreshes others will himself be refreshed. This is the principles of the Scriptures. Then it goes on. It says they're full of envy. Right? Because, man, when you do look up and look at others, all you see is they got more than I do. They have better stuff than I do. And you start looking around, and envy is the result. And because of envy, then all kinds of wickedness begins to creep in. So you begin to want to murder somebody, so they're not in your so that they're not higher than you. They're not wealthier than you. You just go on a killing rampage. They're full of strife. They're arguing with each other, and who's got better this and that, and it's just this strife. There's deceit. Now we're beginning to move lying into it, and so I can cover up my malice, my hatred. But that's all that this is. They're gossips. Now we're going to talk about all these people. So I'm going to talk bad. I'm going to gossip about what's wrong with everybody. I'm going to slander. That is to put down, truth or not. I'm going to put people down. Gossip is where we may or may not be telling the truth. Slander is when we're telling the truth when people have done wrong, simply to glorify their wrong, to make us look better. And so there's slander that's going on. They're God haters. They hate God. Listen, if you hate the people of God, then you also hate God. And they're God haters. They're insolent. That means they're full of pride. They're arrogant. They're boastful. Listen, is it not what you see in the world today? This is how psychotic we have become. And then he says, they invent ways of doing evil. It's not like we're content with this. How can we be even more evil? And so they invent ways of doing evil. That's why when you move away from sexual, what is natural, and you move anywhere else, you're going to go to bisexual, or you're going to go to homosexual, or you're going to go to bestiality, or you're going to start preying on kids. It always is a downward spiral. You continue to invent new ways of just destroying your body through sexual perversion. And it's the same thing in everything else. You begin to invent new ways of being greedy and fulfilling that tank of yours. And so this is what's going on. Then it says they disobey their parents. Come on, that's right in the middle of all this stuff. Disobeying parents. Listen, that's why that one had the promise of God. The first one with the promise. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Do this, that your days may be long on the earth, right? That's the whole point of that, because God knows at our heart we're rebellious. And so we're going to rebel against any authority. And where does it begin? In the home, from the child. That's why it has to be nipped in the bud. That's why it has to be stopped and put down as fast as it can, because it will destroy them. Not because it's dishonoring to you, but it will destroy them. Then he gets to verse 31, and he says they have no understanding. All of a sudden, you've lost your mind, right? No fidelity. That is, that there's no trustworthiness. You can't trust anybody. There's no love, right? They're without love. They're void. That's why moms can choose to just randomly kill their children in the womb. That's why in Jewish days they would offer their children to the fire. There's no love. There's no like, oh no, I'm going to protect what's mine. No, there's no that. Only self-love. And then it says there's no mercy. Verse 32, although they knew God's righteous decree, they knew inherently, we know there's a price to pay for sin, right? We know that. Our laws are written that way. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, look what they do. They not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. There's this, hey, come on, join me in my foolishness. Join me in my stupidity. Do you not feel the pressure to do that in this world today? Just to join people in that? This is the world without God. We're not done. Tomorrow, chapter 2, we're jumping into more, and he's got more to say about this. All right, man, Lord bless you guys. Have a great one. I can't wait to open up the book with you again in the morning. Love you guys.